I'm Kelly Forden, and I am here today with Toni Ann Johnson, and we are going to be discussing her story, Time Travel, from her new award-winning collection, Light Skin Gone to Waste, which comes out October 15th from the University of Georgia Press. So it's great to have you here, Toni Ann. We've met before. We met at the One Story Conference a few years back, and I'm thrilled to have had a chance to read the entire arc. This manuscript is amazing.
Thank you so much. And I am so happy to be here and grateful. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, we're going to talk about time travel, but before we get into that story, can you tell us a little bit about the collection and how time travel fits in?
Sure. So Time Travel is the last story in the collection. The collection starts in 1962 with the patriarch of the family, Phil, who is a Black psychologist and psychoanalyst from the Bronx. He and his wife moved from the Bronx to Monroe, New York, which is a white, mostly blue-collar town in upstate New York. And the character Maddie, who appears as an unnamed character in Time Travel, is their daughter. So she's born there in the town. Phil has an older daughter, Livia, from a previous marriage. And Maddie is the one who grows up in the town. Livia lives primarily with her mother in the Bronx and just comes up on weekends. And Phil and Velma have what turns out to be a tumultuous marriage. Maddie has a bit of a difficult time navigating through her time in Monroe. She makes friends, but even her friends who genuinely like her have some racist ideas that in some ways impact her in a way that makes her really have to think more deeply about who she is. Because she's thinking about herself in comparison to them and then in comparison to her cousin who's from a Black neighborhood and trying to figure out who she is. So Time Travel, where Maddie is unnamed, is kind of a response to an earlier story called Claiming Tobias, where Maddie's first best friend is a young white boy who lives across the street from her, and they're really, really close. Because Maddie is so light-skinned, when they meet, race isn't really part of their friendship. He doesn't understand what she is. When they're a little bit older, around age 6, so they meet as babies, he realizes that she is Black, and that kind of blows up their friendship. And Time Travel is kind of a response to that story.
And he acts in time travel as if none of that ever happened, which I found to be so painful. And then you have a novella, so I've read the whole manuscript, but I haven't read the novella that came out last year. And Can you describe that for us?
Sure. That's called Homegoing. And in Homegoing, Maddie and Tobias are reunited when they're in their 40s. So time travel talks about, they're in their 20s when time travel happens in the present. She talks about their past when they're little kids, and then she projects into the future when she's older and maybe she won't be quite as angry. And that's when we meet them. She is a little bit older. However, she finds that she is still a little bit angry, and they do have a confrontation, and he is somewhat stunned that she remembers all this. He does, according to him, he didn't really even notice she was Black and all that stuff that people say when they don't want to admit that they're racist. Which makes it 10 times worse. It's so much worse. But there is, the thing about that relationship is, I think when you do meet as really little kids and you love each other as really little kids and you have that history, there is a genuine affection. Even when there's negativity connected to it, your soul can't forget the connection. So if you loved that person when you were a little kid, even if they hurt you, you don't really forget the love that came before whatever broke the friendship apart. So that's that's what I was wrestling like through all of those stories. So that kid really, in the kid that inspired the story really hurt my feelings, but he was my first best friend and I loved him and I have memories of him that I love. And so I was trying to kind of weave all that in there. Homegoing is wholly fictional. So it's, based on real things, but we did not in real life, I did not reconnect with him in my 40s. And, so that was fiction. But time travel, we really did run into each other in our 20s. And I was really trying to understand what I was thinking. I remember that meeting and I remember just thinking to myself, you asshole, but being pleasant, but I just wasn't open. I wasn't emotionally open to him, but the way he was so happy to see me. And I could tell, wow, he remembers when we loved each other.
Right. So and he was just skipping over the rest of it because he couldn't handle it. And it's so hard. You did such a good job because it's so awkward when you run in. I mean, I'm just projecting like, if I've been in a fight with someone or whatever, and you run into them, it's so hard to maintain that not incivility, but like not smiling and not asking the question because it comes so naturally. But it was so like justified. And and I was just so surprised that he didn't get it at all, although I totally understand that as well. He had created a different reality in his head where he didn't do those things, or he buried it.
He wasn't the one who got hurt.
Right.
For him, it was just like he was in a community where he was accepted and welcomed. I wasn't. So it's possible that he didn't even really remember that part.
Right.
He just went along with his merry little life and probably didn't think about it. I was the one who was like stuck there. Like I can't believe that happened.
Yeah. And you were, so that's what I wanted to ask you too. So many of these cultural touch points, like the easy bake oven and the Carvel ice cream and all that stuff, I was getting the impression that it was based somewhat in lived experience because it felt so real. Is it fun to write fiction because what you can't remember, you can make up? Or did you at some point think, I'm going to write a memoir of this?
That's a really good question. When I was beginning the work or beginning to share it with an agent, she asked me why it wasn't memoir. And I guess I felt like memoir would constrain me to the fact. And I couldn't really remember all the facts. I could remember how I felt about things. I could remember some details. I could remember some things that people said, but I didn't want to not be able to create dialogue that I liked or to create characters that would be kind of combinations of people. I mean, I guess you can do that in memoir, but I felt like if I did it as a memoir, I would be more challenged on, what actually happened. People would be more angry about it. My father was still alive when I started working on this, and he would have hated it. If I published it as a memoir, it would have just been a nightmare. And my cousin, Elle Johnson, is a memoirist, and she wrote a memoir that came out last year, and her mother is still angry with her for publishing it as a memoir. And I'm sure my mother is angry about me publishing what I publish because she thinks she's in everything, even stuff that isn't even about her, she thinks is her. So it's just, I think, easier for me to have a bit more freedom to create writing it as fiction than as memoir. And I can fill in stuff that I can't remember or that I can't know. Like there's a story from my father's point of view with his white mistress in his office. I couldn't know what the hell happened in there. I remember the office. I remember how it was laid out and the details in it. And I remember the time, but I had to be able to make up some of those details. I couldn't have done that in memoir. So.
Right. And so the first story, and I just got the arc and I read it really quickly, so I don't have all the dates down, but the first story is like 1962. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And then it goes, there's quite a few stories in the 70s, which is a period that I remember really well too. But it's interesting because it takes place in New York in these suburbs. And I thought it was really shocking how prejudiced it was. It was horrible. The first story is when Phil and Velma move into the house in the suburbs, and literally everybody is just awful.
I should clear, I hope that this helps clear some things up. New York, upstate New York is racist. Mm-hmm. So it's not Westchester.
Yeah, right.
Sophisticated, very urban, educated, worldly people. Where I grew up, that exists now. I think there are many more sophisticated people in Monroe now. In 1962, there were some, but not a whole lot. It was more a new place. It wasn't a place that people from the city lived. There were people from the city that would come up in the summer and stay in the bungalows, and it was like a resort town, but there weren't a whole lot of people from liberal New York. There were people who moved out of the city to get away from Black people and Latinos and expected to not run into anyone like me. And in fact, there was a young girl that I met in middle school who wanted me to come over, and her father said, absolutely not. We moved out of New York to get away from the N words and the S words, and you are not bringing one to our house.
Unbelievable.
And that was the culture that I experienced. Now, everybody wasn't like that. There were, in fact, some old money people in Monroe who were literally like descendants of the founders of the town. And they were wealthy and they were sophisticated. And they were actually quite nice to my parents. My parents went to parties at their houses. There was a middle-class African-American man who was a dentist who was quite successful, but he too had difficulties there. And there were a couple of African-American families whose parents had roots in the town for different reasons. And my parents weren't friends with them. I was friends with their kids, but we didn't all socialize together. I played with their daughters, but alone, like not with my family. Uh-huh. And so, it's not that everybody was racist. So even then, even in 1962, when my parents moved in, there were people who came to their defense, even as there were people protesting them moving in. So it was a variety, but some people think of that area as the suburbs. It was rural. It wasn't even suburban. There were cows up the street. There was farmland. Like, it was very new and green.
What's the closest big city to Monroe?
Newburgh or Middletown.
Newburgh.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just trying to get It's
also not far from West Point.
Okay.
City, but it's a well-known area. And that's, of course, more sophisticated. It's, it's a school. Right. But sorry, go ahead.
So I was just thinking about her. So Phil in the stories, or you can speak to your dad in real life, whatever. I just thought it would be so painful on a daily basis, but he just loved being out in the country. He wanted to be able to enjoy the water and enjoy the greenery. But what do you think gave him the strength to withstand that kind of harassment?
Well, first of all, I don't think he expected quite that level of harassment that he experienced immediately. My father was educated at Yeshiva University, and my father was very light-skinned, very handsome. There were likely people in school with him who didn't realize that he was Black. And I think because he's very light, he was very light, I think he might have thought that people would leave him alone. So I don't think he anticipated it, but he also had a job, which just outside of Monroe, he was hired for this position. It was a fairly prestigious position for a young doctor, especially for a person of color. He was welcomed in that circle and wasn't experiencing racism there. And so I think he just thought that kind of reception that he received in that community would be similar to what it would be like, where he moved. And that wasn't the case. But then when we moved to the next house, I mean, I wasn't born yet, but when they moved to the next neighborhood. There were people there who did welcome them. The next door neighbors were very welcoming on both sides. There were people around the neighborhood who weren't, but they didn't experience the same thing in that neighborhood that they experienced in the community where they first rented. And I think that my father just did not want to be told that he had to live in a segregated area in New York City. He saw the Bronx as a ghetto and didn't want to stay there. I wish that my father had been more interested in the few middle-class Black neighborhoods that might have been available to him, or more diverse neighborhoods. And his response when I asked him about that years ago was that he had this job and he moved, in proximity to the job. So it wasn't, he wouldn't admit that he was shunning those other places, but he was kind of justifying we had to live there because this is where I worked, which isn't true. We could have lived elsewhere, but that was his choice. I think he felt like this was a place he could come and make a name for himself. And he did. My dad was very successful in that area. And he continued his practice from 1962 until 2013 when he was diagnosed with dementia. He always worked and had a good practice there and in New York City. So he achieved what he wanted in that area. He liked it.
I'm just going to have to say, people, that I want to talk about the whole collection, and we might get off the time travel story a little bit. So this is so people will read the whole collection. I just want to talk a little bit about the subjects. But so when you create like Velma, so Phil is married to Velma, and Velma and Phil have Maddie, and all of the stories are written in close third, except for the final story, which is in Maddie's voice. Is that correct?
The second story is in second person. It's you.
Okay.
She's talking to herself. It's Maddie's point of view, but the you is her. The last story, Time Travel, is also second person, but the you is unnamed Tobias.
Okay.
And then the story, there's a story called The Way We Fell Out of Touch, which is Velma and her white housekeeper, Gertie. And that's told in first person, almost like a play. It's like a series of monologues.
I love that story.
And then Susie, there's the cousin character, and that's in first person too.
Okay. Okay. So I felt like when we get to Maddie in the final one, it in the way that all linked short story collections can build on each other, you totally understand what's happening in time travel, why she's behaving that way. And it seems completely justified. And even the fact that she stopped to even interact with him at all after what he did struck me as like
6 years old.
I know. And it was his parents. It wasn't his fault. I know. It's just so hard. Like, I guess because by the time we get to time travel, the whole family has experienced so many things that I wonder, like, how do you get over that? How do you get past it? And maybe you don't ever. I don't know.
An interesting question. Like, I don't think from my parents' point of view, I don't feel like they felt like there was anything to get over. And my parents just refused to have any empathy for how I felt about it. So I would try to bring up how much I hated so much of what happened, and neither of them wanted to hear it, because from their point of view, I was so lucky that I didn't grow up where they grew up. And I was so lucky because they had money and we did great things and I lived in a beautiful home. They thought my life was great. They did not want to hear any of the negative. And after a while, I just stopped telling them. And then when I was older and I remembered like how bad some of that stuff was that I didn't tell them, and I tried to tell them, they still just didn't want to hear it. They did not want to hear it. I told my mother a story about a year ago about something really awful that happened, and my mother laughed. And I was wow. Yeah. So
wow. What do you think?
Well, she's old. Maybe she, I don't know, but it was, like, wow.
What is going on? And they did keep saying that throughout the whole collection. Oh, you're so lucky. You're so lucky. That came up over and over again. And then a lot of the time, Maddie seemed to be they would say, you're being so dramatic. You're being so dramatic, calm down. And I felt really bad. I don't know if that was a 70s thing, because a lot of parents were doing their own thing during that time period. Yes. And they just didn't want to deal with kids. And kids, we were supposed to be, seen and not heard. But on top of the regular trauma of that, then you have the fact that Maddie is being bullied and being ostracized. And it just, because I related, because I'm white, I don't relate. I wasn't, I didn't experience the racism, but I related to everything up to that, like, being ostracized or being bullied. And kids are so cruel. Mm-hmm. So then to add that extra layer is unbelievable.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess when originally you asked, like, how did I get over that? I think part of getting over it, part of it was I was always told it wasn't that bad. I was always told that I was overreacting. And so part of me kept questioning, well, how bad? Maybe it wasn't that bad, but why am I still processing it? Why, if it wasn't so bad, why am I still thinking about it? Why am I still remembering it? Why does it still hurt?
Right.
That's part of it. But then also part of it is, if I don't get past it, where does that leave me? So if I remain in that, angry, hostile, retaliatory kind of space, who am I? Like, do I want to be? I don't want to be that person. So, part of it is just recognizing human frailties. Like, these people were a product of their time. The larger American culture was racist. It just was.
Yes.
So, even if it wasn't like overtly racist ideas were just brimming all over the place, and people were absorbing them. So people were making assumptions about everybody Black, whether they knew you or not. If you were Black, they thought these things about you. And so that wasn't always the fault of the people in the town. That was part of being part of a racist culture. And so I can't hold on to so much anger about things individual people did because maybe they didn't know better, or maybe they didn't know how else to act. That was what they saw modeled from their parents, who saw it modeled from their parents. So that was how life was. But what I hope I got to was that everybody has kindness and cruelty in them. Everybody is, sometimes nice, sometimes not so nice. Even Maddie's not so nice all the time.
Right. And she says that
too. Yeah.
Yeah, she says that in Time Travel. And I think that when people read the entire collection, they'll get you did such a fantastic job of, like, in some stories, Velma will be very cruel to Maddie and, and hitting her, and just not being, but then in other stories, you get everything from Velma's point of view, which I think really opens it up and helps the reader understand where she's coming from. And Phil as well, because he lost his father when he was young and had his own set of traumas. So I guess I would ask, when did you get to the point where you realized I can write this as a collection of linked stories? And how did you decide which stories to leave in and which to leave out?
All right. So the first part is I was in the movie business for a really long time. So I was writing movies, and I got to a point where I was constantly just doing assignments and executing other people's ideas. And I decided I wanted to write a book. So I sort of dropped out of that business and took time off to write a book that then didn't sell. And so then I went back to school and got an MFA in creative writing. And while I was in school, I was introduced to a bunch of linked story collections. Drown by Junot Diaz and The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven were two that seemed like they were doing things that I had been thinking about. So both of them were sort of looking at childhood and young adulthood through the lens of what was going on in their environment at the time. Well, like with Juno's, it was that, but also processing the relationship with his father. And in the Sherman Alexie collection, it was a lot of like stuff that happened on the reservation, but dealing with racism and the way Native kids were treated and looked at. And I saw some possibilities for doing something similar. So I started to think about more stories then. I had originally thought of the Claiming Tobias story after something that happened on the set of Ruby Bridges, when there was a scene that I'd written that Ruby had told me about, where she was in school. She had been by herself the whole time. She comes together with other kids, and a little white boy says, "My mommy told me I can't play with you because you're a nigger." And on set, the little actor refused to say that. And he was like, "I can't say that. That's mean." And then finally, the director was able to persuade him that it's for the movie, it's not real. And so finally he says it. He says the line, Uzan calls cut. Uzan was the director. Uzan Palsy was the director. She calls cut. That little boy threw himself into the little actress's lap, hugged her, and sobbed and said, "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it." And then as the actress said, "It's okay because it's just pretend." And that story, what happened on set, just brought back all the stuff in Claiming Tobias for me. And that little boy never said he was sorry. And that was what triggered me to want to write Claiming Tobias. I didn't write it for about 7 more years, but I was thinking about it all the time. And I just kept seeing myself like as little Chaz and him as that other kid. And I wanted him to hug me and say he was sorry because we were that age.
Yes.
So that's how that started. And then I came out of the MFA program. I wrote a novel, and then I started working on all the stories. And well, that's not true. During the MFA program, I did start working on the stories, but they weren't that good. I was still figuring out fiction. And my thesis project was Light Skin Gone to Waste. And it was just maybe 5 stories. And so I think I've answered a couple of parts of your question, but then the last part, how to decide what to put in. Oh my God. So this collection was at one time 500 pages long. It included the novella Homegoing, and it included stories from the sister's point of view and from Phil's mother's point of view, and another novella with Maddie at college. And it was so long. And I was working with an agent who wanted to sell it as a novel. And I kept adding stories like that I was asked to add. And it just turned into this big thing. And she thought it was great. And she sent it out as a novel. And everybody was like, this is like unwieldy. It was just like, and I was crushed. I was devastated because I worked on it for 5 years, like adding everything. And my goal was I wanted to sell a book and make some money because I wasn't making any money on my fiction. My first book, like it did well, but I lost money because I spent more money promoting it than I actually took it. So I was like, I really want to sell a book. I'll do whatever it takes. Like, sell a book. And she was like, okay, just do this. And I know this is going to sell. And it didn't sell. And I was so mad. I had I put all my eggs into this basket. And so that was in January of 2021 when it didn't sell. By March, it was pretty clear it wasn't going to sell. And then my agent was asking me to do a rewrite. And I was like, leave me alone. And I was like, I'm done. I can't even talk about this book anymore. But then I saw the call for submissions to the Flannery O'Connor Award. And I was like, you know what? The reason this doesn't work as a novel is because it's not fucking novel. It's a story collection. Exactly. And so I pulled out all of the extra stuff that I had added, and I just made it more focused on Maddie. So I took out the sister stories. I took out there was also a story from a next door neighbor's point of view that was in the we voice. And I loved that story, but I just like, it has to be bare bones because there's a 75,000 word limit for the Flannery O'Connor Award. So I couldn't fit everything. And so it was luck. It was like, okay, I have to find a way to make this feel like a cohesive thing, even though it's not a novel. It has to sort of feel like there's some reason that these stories are together in this way. And so that's when I just went back to the original idea of the book, which was very much focused on Maddie, because I'm Maddie. So,
right.
about me.
Yeah.
So that was how that
I think that's so thrilling when you actually achieve that goal of telling your own story, because I've been trying to do that for years in that same time period. It's so hard. And I think part of the reason is using your own experiences to make a fictional character and somehow separating it and being able to describe that character well enough, like how it's you. So you think, oh, well, everyone will just get it. Why should, but you have to go, it's actually harder than creating a character from scratch,
hard.
I think.
Yeah, it is hard because you have to be fair to everyone too. Like even when it's about you, like you have to be somewhat fair to the to the other people. Like you have to try to understand where other people are coming from and what they're, like when I remember some stories, the initial memory of it is just from my point of view. I'm not taking into consideration what everybody else has gone through and why they might be mean. I don't care when I'm just thinking about it. But you can't write it like that. And you just have to be more generous. It forces you to see people, to see everyone's humanity, not just your own. Otherwise, who cares? Then you're just like talking about, oh, poor me. This happened to me. And isn't that terrible? It's like, how boring. It's even boring to me. Yeah. So I have to make it interesting for myself.
Yeah. And I bet it's like really cathartic to see people who've pained you. I mean, the Velma characters, to see her and what she might have come through and even Phil, I mean, to see them from a different angle must have been somewhat cathartic because otherwise you can just
think hard. Yeah. It was really hard.
I bet it.
Those events were hard to go back into for real.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie. Like sometimes I was like, oh man, I don't know if I can even do this. But once they were done, like by the time I was putting the collection together, I had already like written most of the stories. Mm-hmm. So like the hardest one, I think, was the penultimate story, the Make a Space. Mm-hmm. That was really hard because I was still processing that there was a day that I'm writing about, and that was a real day. And it was, oh my God, that was so painful and so ridiculously dramatic in real life. When I think about like how crazy my parents acted in real life, like to just have to relive that. And then also I was trying to find like some respite in the stories, like so some moments of comedy or just something light, and it was really hard because it was really painful. But
it doesn't I mean, it's super, there's a lot of pain, but for some reason, because I as a reader, you end up really rooting for Maddie and hoping that someone will listen to her and hoping that she'll get, I mean, that I think is why time travel, I wanted to talk about the whole collection and not just time travel this time, because you really have to read the whole collection to realize what she's been through. I mean, time travel stands alone, don't get me wrong, mm-hmm. but I think it just has so powerful when you get to that moment and you think, oh my God, she has to see this guy again. And I can't wait to read Homegoing.
Yeah.
Is it Homecoming?
So homegoing is the word. It comes out of African American culture, and it's what African Americans call a funeral. But it was also, so I was using it, because there is a funeral in the story, but it's also Maddie going back to Monroe. And when we meet Maddie, she really like still doesn't have a good feeling about Monroe, but go back there for a couple of reasons. And so I was just kind of using the word to express both of those things.
Mm-hmm. And did you go back to when you were researching and writing, did you spend time again in Monroe? And
Yeah, my mom still lives in the area. She lives outside of Monroe in a town called Tuxedo. And so I've been going back there usually like at least once a year for many, many years. And I have friends that are still there or still connected. Like one of my best friends, her parents still live in the area. Another friend lives in Warwick, like there's people that I'm still close to. And then somebody from my real life, like who was from the area that my dad was from in the Bronx, he and his husband moved to that area. So that was crazy to me. It's like they switched places. Right. So there's a lot of, I have had reasons to go back to Monroe, and I don't hate Monroe anymore. But what was really eye-opening was when Trump ran for president and was elected, like all the vitriol and the racism and the hatred and all that stuff just came flooded back. And I'm in a Facebook group with people who grew up in Monroe, and you see it. It's just so apparent. One of my friends was at the January 6th insurrection. Wow. He since unfriended me, but and he was not racist when we were kids. He was my friend. Right. He's like gone off the deep end. But yeah, it's like, I wasn't, so it was kind of vindicating because I was like, aha, I told you. I told my mother, I was like, I told you that's who these people were. You wouldn't listen to me. She didn't want to. And now what does she say now? Well, she's not talking to me at the moment, but when we were still speaking, sometimes she would be able to admit that sometimes she would be able to say, yeah, I guess this area is kind of racist. Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, and I think it's interesting to growing up Catholic, say this is a little bit off, but, growing up Catholic and then with people who are very devout and then having family members who are gay. Right. And then they can't accept that, and I think, okay, well, where are you coming from? What did you have to hide? Like, I mean, do they get to a stage where you have had to hide so much or go along with the program for so long that you're incapable of changing, you're incapable of seeing the world from because if you did see it from a different angle, your entire world would implode. Mm-hmm. And would that be just too much for you to take? I don't know. It's interesting just because there's an inauthenticity when you're just sort of operating within a religious system and you have to adhere to these rules. Then it's almost like there's no space for authenticity because it's like, oh, we can't look at that. Like, don't look at that. It's not there. But that kind of authenticity ruins people and ruins relationships, because if you can't be authentic with your kids, then they don't really know you. They don't really understand like who you are. And that, I think it also leads to like your development is kind of curtailed. Like as an adult, it's almost like you become a bit emotionally immature because you don't have the ability to actually live in your full authentic truth. And so you're smaller, but then you live from this smaller place. And you're not real. You're just you're just a little part of yourself. Right. So, and then I think I think there's a thing about shame. Well, this is why I love fiction so much, because, we've been like talking about all the schools who are trying to limit what we know about our past or whatever. And then when you read a fictional story and you really identify with the character, you cannot help but realize how horrific like racism is, or, bigotry of any kind. If if it's an LGBTQ kid or whatever, you identify with the other person. And I think that's where fiction is very helpful. And I'm losing my train of thought. I was going to say something else after that, but I think I'm following you though. I think that in fiction, you recognize others, like when people are othered and you are able to put yourself in the other's shoes. So I'm not, part of the LGBTQ community, but because I've been othered elsewhere, when I read fiction from that point of view, I have all the ability to have compassion and empathize because I have a sense of being othered. I know what it feels like. And it's
Right.
the same pain in some way. Like when somebody tells you can't marry this person because of that. You're a woman, you can't marry a woman because of that. Like it's so painful because I just feel it, so deeply. So I think
Right.
that's kind of what you were saying about fiction. It's like it helps us connect and empathize.
Right. Yeah. And you have another great story. We were talking about it before and I know we're going over our time, but you have another great story in there about Gertie, who's the white cleaning lady, and how she's Catholic. She wants to marry a Jewish guy and her mother won't let her. But then the Jewish guy comes over to visit and sees Velma and Phil, and he's prejudiced against Black people. And we were talking about how like there's such a disconnect there. And yet people do want to feel better. There's all the history of Catholics, Jews, and Blacks in the beginning of the 19th century and how Catholics and Jews just stepped on Black people because they were trying to crawl out of that terrible situation. But you would have thought we'd all be better off if we all banded together, but it just doesn't work like that, right?
Yeah.
It just doesn't.
Yeah. And I'm not sure like how the story we don't see him. We don't spend a whole lot of time with him. So I think in that situation, he's seeing his wife, who he wanted to marry for all this time. He's seeing her work for Black people. And I think that's a very specific thing. So like in his mind, he's the husband. So he's the one who was supposed to come in and give her a better life. And so he feels like this is something I can do to honor my responsibility in giving her a better life. You don't have to clean anymore. Maybe he wouldn't do that if they were a white family. But I think because they're Black, in his mind, in that time, which is in the 70s, he's feeling like, well, this is kind of beneath what I want my wife to be. So just because he calls them what he calls them, I'm not certain that if he were out in the world that he would be using the N-word, or that if Black people came to his dry cleaner, he would turn them away. So I think that there are, yes, maybe he's racist, but I don't necessarily mean to suggest that he's a cruel person or that he's like that he would be violent or overtly mean. Like, I don't think he would say it to their face. I think that that's how he feels, and he's comfortable saying it within his family, which I think is true about a lot of people with racist ideas. They might say those words at home in their family, but they might not be so mean that they're out pointing out people and calling them out. So I have some compassion for that character. I also know that character was belittled by other people and hurt. And so he's coming from that place. And so, yeah, I mean,
he's trying to gain some sort of power hold, or, like his footing in the world.
Just like Velma.
Yeah, exactly.
Just like Velma. So Velma will look at somebody and say, she's white trash,
Right.
So
yeah.
I don't want to point people out and make them bad. I want people to have some understanding that we're all sort of flawed in this culture.
And you did an amazing job of that. I didn't get the sense that, and I didn't mean to bring him up and point to him as like a bad guy, but I thought that was a sad moment. But you did a great job of giving everybody, a complexity and a nuance and a humanity that I really appreciated. And the last question I'll ask you is, tell me about the title, the origin of the title of the collection.
So the first time I heard the phrase light skin gone to waste, what it literally meant was a light skinned person who had African textured hair. And it's a horrible insult. It's a cruel thing to say. But it's a complicated thing also, because like, why is light skin like so, why are you like looking at light skin as if it's something to be sullied by something that's not typically of light-skinned people. It's just horrible all around. So that's kind of how it's used literally in the story called Light Skin Gone to Waste. But I also thought that it kind of captured things about all of the characters. Like if there's this presumption that somehow being light-skinned is better in this culture or more advantageous. And in some cases, for some people, it probably is. Like it probably has helped some people, but there's all these layers of complexity to like what's behind that and what's lost. In this family's case, like Phil decides to come into this white world, but there's a lot of loss that comes with that. There's a loss of authenticity. There's a loss of community. So yeah, Maddie's light-skinned, but what good does it do her in Monroe? Like, so what? Like she still gets called the N-word. And Phil is light-skinned, but he completely rejects his family and his community. And he's trying to like be in this other community that, they're okay about him, but it's not like he's beloved as part of a community. He left a community where he might have been beloved. So I think that's what it's getting at. It's this like the literal idea of what that is, and then the larger idea of, what is so great about that, and is it that good? Yeah. And then also with Phil, there's a more specific thing about he was treated in his perspective, not as well as his darker skinned brother, because the mother felt like him being light skinned would be an advantage. But then he lost most of the love. He didn't feel like
that was so sad. That was terrible. Yeah. And she really favored the other brother.
Yeah. And Velma is actually biracial. She has a white parent who didn't want her, and she's light-ish, so I was hoping that it would sort of like be this umbrella of the whole sort of experience about colorism in this particular.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it's fantastic. And I'm so thrilled that we got to talk about it, because I think it's going to be a huge success. So I'm really happy for you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks so much, Toni Ann.